Good morning, this is David Jaroszewski, and today I'm going to be talking about my action research project, which thankfully I was able to do right before the world went crazy. I was able to do this during the first few weeks of this past semester. So here's my table of contents. I'm first going to give you a little intro of what I'm doing, then lay out the problem, some of the related literature and journals about it. I will talk about my hypothesis, then I'll go over quickly my methods, the participants that were included, the instruments, experiment design procedure, etc. And then finally, I'll conclude it by going over the results of the study that I conducted, and then reflect on some of the implications and talk about some of the threats to validity. So as teachers, we have dozens and dozens of different types of different teaching strategies, pedagogical approaches that we can use in the classroom, like problem-based learning, multicultural teaching, project-based learning, constructivism, cognitism, context-based learning. The list goes on, and it's really up to the teacher to get to know your students, to analyze your students and identify their strengths and weaknesses, and then craft a curriculum around them. So using the best approaches and strategies that will work best for that specific classroom and your students to best prepare them for getting a good grade, obviously, and then obviously being able to succeed later in life, whether it's in their career or in college. So the main problem for me, the purpose of this action research project is I wanted to really analyze two different teaching strategies and discern which one could lead to more improvement, more engagement, more overall comprehension of the classroom content standards and materials I was teaching throughout. I've obviously, throughout my time doing my single subject teaching credential and in this program, I've studied a lot about different teaching strategies and different approaches that teachers and educators can use to make the classroom the best, to foster that learning environment that's best suited for each student. And I've learned obviously a lot about student-centered learning as opposed to direct teacher learning. So I really wanted to juxtapose the two and then compare and contrast those in a real-life setting and not just read about it in a journal or an article or this or that. So the study I conducted utilized the two, and it was two different junior classes that I had for U.S. history. And I gave them a post-study survey and a post-study formative test on roughly a 2-week Industrial Revolution unit. It ended up being about 2.5, but yeah, it was like 2 to 3 week study. So there was a bunch of awesome literature on this subject. The first one was researchers find student-centered learning approaches help undeserved kids achieve. And it just talked about this research just showed that this type of environment is the best for them in college and their career. So it really helps them build those soft skills that are necessary to succeed in the classroom or in the workplace, etc. The other one, teachers' roles and identities in student-centered classrooms, was talking about how structuring this classroom and making it more student-centered with projects and more group discussions, etc., really heightens their learning and heightens their participation and helps improve their overall learning in the classroom. This one, the National Academies Press, the How People Learn, the Brain-Mind Experience in School, really talked about how direct teacher-led teaching is really good for disseminating really large amounts of content and material. Obviously, if you're standing up there lecturing for an hour, you can go over a bunch of different material and a bunch of different concepts and vocabulary, etc. But it's really hard for students to really be able to comprehend and retain all that information, and it promotes a very passive and superficial learning experience for them. And obviously, as we've learned throughout this program and throughout my single subject teacher credential program, that we want our learning to be really active and vibrant, and we want them to be on their toes and actually experiencing learning and not just sitting there having the information wash over them and they're not really interacting with it. And finally, the last one was just, it talked about really promoting the oral skills, the soft skills between peers and teachers. It involves just a lot of give and take and back and forth, which is really good. It improves the communication between the teacher and the students, and it places students at the center of the learning instruction, which is really awesome. Students have showed that this active learning environment really helps out with their learning and so on. So this standard lecture teaching format may be all right in college. Even then, you know, if you're trying to have a huge lecture with like 500 students, I get it. But when you're in a classroom with 30 students, we really want them interacting with each other, not just the teacher talking for long periods of time. So my hypothesis was students adhering to a student-led teaching and learning environment would see marked improvements across the board in engagement and participation, and their overall test scores and their overall enjoyment with the overall teaching learning environment with my teaching strategy. And then the second classroom would be much more teacher-led and direct teaching with a lot more of me lecturing, PowerPoints, and then taking notes out of the book, etc. And as a result of that, they'd have lower test scores and lower levels of participation and engagement. So the participants in my class were 65 students altogether. Classroom A was 33, classroom B was 32. They were roughly 16 to 17-year-olds. They were my juniors. And the demographic was pretty diverse. It was 41% white, 39% Hispanic, 12% Asian American, and 8% African American. Could you get, and I gave them a post-study and student survey as well as a unit test. So like I said before, it was a 2-week unit on the Industrial Revolution, so the progressive movement, excuse me, Teddy Roosevelt, the women's movement, robber barons, muckrakers, etc. Excuse me, I have a sore throat, so let me take a quick drink of water. I do not have the coronavirus. So period 2 was my U.S. history kids. They were the ones that were exposed to direct teaching-led instruction, so lecturing, traditional approach, PowerPoints. And then classroom B was my period 4 kids, and that was more student-led with daily learning reflections, group projects, them actually really digging into the material, cooperative tasks, group discussions, etc. And then afterwards, I gave them a post-study survey, which would gauge how much they enjoyed it, and then an actual test, the actual formative test for the unit. So the experimental design was quasi-experimental, single group. Obviously, like I mentioned before, it was classroom A and classroom B. The X1 was the teacher-led. X2 was a more student-led, student-centered, etc. Here were the 5 questions that I gave them for their student survey. How much did you enjoy this unit? How engaged were you during this unit? How would you grade the participation of your peers? Did my teaching help you learn? Etc., etc. And this gave them a really good idea of how much they enjoyed it. And obviously for me, it gave me a lot of very good constructive feedback on which teaching approach does in fact work better for the kids' enjoyment and their overall comprehension, and if it really improves test scores. So this was the survey afterwards. On the x-axis, you see the question numbers. On the y, it was the 0 to 10, 0 being the least, 10 being the most. Classroom A is the blue, classroom B is the green, and as you can see, the classroom B with the student-led teaching showed a lot higher enjoyment and overall scores, and how much they enjoyed it, how much it really got their attention and improved their participation. And here's the post-study. So on the x-axis, you can see the kids' scoring percentages with their grades. On the y is the amount of kids that scored in that grade range. And then like before, classroom A is the blue bar, and then classroom B is the green bar. So as you can see, it is shaped in a very common bell-shaped curve. But more students in the second class, in the classroom B, scored higher. And I'll talk about that a little later. So some of the results and reflections. So as you can see, the students that were exposed to more student-centered learning generally scored a lot higher, and they're more engaged with it, as evidenced and corroborated by the survey, as well as the unit tests that I gave at the end. Just students overall were more engaged. They're more the participation levels were a lot higher. I could just see on their faces that they were a lot more engaged and a lot happier in being in the classroom for an hour and a half each day, dealing with me and my teaching, which was awesome. More students, just like I said, illuminated that they were a lot more excited and happier to be taught in that way, as opposed to the first class. A lot of kids were nodding off. You could just tell after about 10, 15, 20 minutes they were just losing interest very quickly in me just lecturing to them and them taking notes and then reading out of the book and maybe having a quick pair share discussion with the classmate next to them. So classroom B, the second class, my period 4, they had higher overall scores compared to the first class. So the mean score of class A was 80.75, and classroom B had a mean score of 85.86. So that was about 5 points higher, or about half a letter grade. So I feel like that was a fairly significant margin for a lot of kids. That almost raised them up by a full letter grade, which was awesome to see. So some of the threats to validity in my project was history. I have a lot of IEP and 504 kids in my class, and they get pulled out once or twice a week, or maybe the aid's not there to help them out. So that can really start to affect the study in various ways. At my Link Learning School with the juniors, they're also in a big project-based learning program right now. So some of them had to miss a couple classes. Full participation, so that definitely affected their grade and being fully immersed in the project. They had to do internships and meet up with people outside. I won't get into that, but they were very involved in that, which is awesome, but it obviously affected my study somewhat. The selection, there's only 2 classes, so it was a pretty small sample size, so it wasn't really exemplify, and it wasn't the whole school, which would have been awesome. There was only 2 tests that were done. It wasn't a multitude of tests over an extended period of time, so that made a little difference. And finally, the experimental mortality or differential attrition. I conducted this study early in the semester, so a few students kids were still moving around the classes, and one transferred to a charter school, so that definitely affected the research study. And finally, with external, both classes knew that I was doing this. I gave them, just a quick 5-minute brief on what I was doing, so that may have affected their participation and productivity in various ways. And finally, the implications. Like I said, it was small sample size. It's not entirely reflective. You can't generalize this whole study and attach it to the entire school, because it didn't represent the entire student body or general population. But I thought it was a very enlightening action research project, at least for me personally. Students, as I've learned over the course of the last 2 years, students learn in a variety of ways. So some students might actually prefer a direct student-led or a direct teacher-led project in teaching approach, as opposed to a student-led one. More long-term studies would probably be required for this. There's ample studies and articles about student-led teaching, but in student-centered learning environments. But it would still be awesome for me personally to do it, and obviously, those kind of go together with more time required, which would be awesome. This was only about a 2.5-week program, but anyways, I had so much fun in this class. I learned so much in this overall unit. So I just want to thank you so much, Luke, for everything you've taught us. I know this last semester was a little crazy, and I know you're doing your best, but thank you so much for having me, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.